Hello and welcome to another video lecture. This is Mr. Mosier for Mr. Mosier's 8th grade U.S. history class. This is the last lecture on our look at the Cold War. And so today we're going to be looking at kind of what brought about the end of the Cold War. There are three sections in the textbook that might be beneficial for you to kind of look over as we kind of wrap up the 20th century. Nixon's presidency and Watergate, pages 926 to 931. America in the 1970s, 932 to 936. And then the end of the 20th century, pages 950 to 953. The guiding questions for this lecture looks at why did so many Americans lose hope and faith in the government in the 1970s? How did Reagan restore hope and optimism in the 80s? What brought about the end of the Cold War? So those will be kind of our major topics for today. The 1970s was just kind of a really rough decade for a lot of different reasons. In the 1973, the Middle East stopped sending America oil in what's called a oil embargo. So they stopped selling us oil, which causes gas prices to skyrocket and also leads to a series of gas shortages. So it's hard to get to school, it's hard to get to work without gas, and it just kind of cripples the American economy. And then on top of that, President Nixon gets in trouble for lying about and trying to cover up some of his advisors sneaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C., which becomes known as the Watergate scandal, which will bring down his presidency. And so Nixon is forced to resign in 1974, and President Gerald Ford comes in as president, and he wasn't elected. He was just appointed as vice president to replace the former vice president for Nixon, who was also forced out of office over a scandal. So full of political scandals in the 70s with the Nixon administration. And then in 1975, America, which had slowly been doing throughout the early 70s, which was kind of pulling out of Vietnam. And that was kind of Nixon's strategy in the early 70s was Vietnamization, is put the Vietnamese in control of their own security. But as he begins pulling out of forces, the South Vietnamese forces are overrun by the Northern Vietnamese forces. And in 1975, as American forces are evacuating out of the embassy in Saigon, Saigon falls to the communists. And so this long conflict that started in the 1950s ends with kind of an American defeat. And then in 1979, Americans are held hostage when there's a revolution in Iran, and they storm our embassy in Tehran in Iran, and hostages are held for many, many days, which kind of further humiliates the American government as well as the American people. So the 1970s were just kind of a very, very rough decade. So in the 1980s it comes, a new person is elected president. His name is Ronald Reagan. He was a former governor of California, a Republican, staunch conservative, as well as a staunch anti-Soviet and communist. So is elected in the 1980s under the kind of the banner of hope and optimism, that together we can fix what's wrong with America. And this is exactly what a lot of his administration tries to do, is bring about more of this hope and optimism. A lot of the movies from the 1980s and TV shows from the 1980s really tries to capture this idea that America's better day is it's right around the corner. It's happening. We're getting past the 70s and moving into the 80s, and hopefully a better time is ahead of us. But also in regards to the Cold War, we see, in a sense, really an escalation between us and the Soviet Union, which did not take place in the 70s. Reagan calls for the increase in military spending during the 1980s, refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire, and really begins ratcheting up military spending throughout the 1980s. The Soviet Union have a new leader as well. His name is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he comes to power in 1985. Now, the Soviet Union was really struggling in the 1980s in that their economy was really struggling. As we've talked before in class, that in communism, it doesn't create an incentive to do your very best or work your hard, because you get paid kind of regardless. There's very little incentive or drive because you get paid regardless. There's no kind of that external competition spirit. And so the economy was shaky, and with this increase in military spending that America was spending, the Soviet Union felt they had to catch up or fall behind. And so it just created additional strains in the Soviet economy. And the Soviet was spending so much money on their military hardware that a lot of the people were suffering with bread lines and other economic problems that were taking place in the Soviet Union. Now, the two leaders will eventually meet and have discussions and talks to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons, which is very, very important. But as we get to the end of the 1980s, we start seeing kind of the collapse and the cracks beginning to form on the Soviet Union as they've had to kind of retool their economy to open it up to more market-based economy, more of a capitalist system. We start seeing a little bit more of a fragmenting of the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe, and it starts mostly in Eastern Europe. In November of 1989, the citizens of Berlin will eventually end up tearing down the wall that had separated the two sides of Berlin since the 1960s. This symbol of the Iron Curtain, of oppression of the Soviet influence, sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, was allowed to continue with the tearing down of this large wall in Eastern Europe. And pretty soon, lots of the Eastern communist countries in Eastern Europe begin to kind of fall from within. The people of themselves kind of stand up and rebel and overthrow their government. So it wasn't, the Cold War didn't end in an actual war, which is what most people were always worried about, that there'd be some kind of World War III that may turn into a nuclear war take place. But what really would happen is kind of a collapse from within. The people themselves started to stand up and demand for change in their countries, and pretty soon most of the Eastern Bloc countries, their communist leaders are deposed and removed, and newly freely democratic governments are placed in their stead. And then in 1990s, the Soviet Union collapses too, in a failed coup d'etat from these hardline communist Soviets who try to take out Mikhail Gorbachev. They don't succeed, and they end up being taken out of office. And eventually in 1991, the Soviet Union will also collapse, and a democratic leader, Boris Yeltsin, will come to power. So the Soviet Union no longer exists because of this collapse of communism in the late 1980s and early 1990s. So where the world was once divided between the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union countries in the east, and the NATO countries in the west, the really last remaining surviving communist countries that are in existence today would be China, which is more of a political communist system, not so much an economic one. You've got also Vietnam as a major one, Korea, North Korea, and of course Cuba is really all that's left. And so the Cold War kind of has come now to an end at the end of the 20th century, and that tensions and conflicts no longer really exist. So what's the aftermath of the end of the Cold War? Well, the 1990s was a pretty good decade, but we see a major shift happen with 9/11 in the early 2000s. And so now we have kind of more tensions and conflicts around the world. And the question, which has always been kind of America's question since our founding, is what is our place in the role of the world? We've been very isolationist in our past. We've also been a superpower that's been directly involved in a lot of aspects of international affairs. So what is our role? Global terrorism being on the rise, tensions in the Middle East, liberty movements in places like Syria and Iraq, climate change, proliferation of nuclear weapons with Korea and Iran, oil and energy, anti-Americanism, feelings and sentiment. All of these are pieces that are still very much at play today that are shaping the world that we are all living in today. And who knows how the future will unfold, but the questions are still there, is what should America's role be in world affairs? So the Cold War did not end in a big bang, luckily. It was not a nuclear explosion, no nuclear World War III. It was brought down from the people themselves in these communist countries who felt they wanted to live under freedom and not live under a totalitarian dictatorship that had been created during the Cold War. So thank you for listening to these Cold War lectures. As always, if you have questions or comments, please make sure you come talk to me. Thanks for listening.